Welcome to All Power to the Developing, a podcast of the Eastside Institute, where social justice, human development, and community building come together. This is where you will meet activists, artists, teachers, scholars, helpers, and healers who are bringing creativity, hope, and possibility to individuals and communities all over the world. Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Power to the Developing. This is your host, Desiree Wandan, Des for short. I'm joined by a special co-host today, Dan Friedman.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited about being here today. I am the managing producer of All Power to the Developing, not usually on the air, but I'm very interested in and passionate about and was eager to meet Ramsey Kanaan, who is our guest. And I am also on the faculty of the Eastside Institute, and I run a free online school called Let's Learn. So again, that's who I am. Great to see you all. Oh, no, I don't see you at all, but it's great to be here.
Yes.
I'm going to give it back to you, Des.
And I think Dan kind of gave us a little preview. Our guest today is an independent publisher and a founder of the PM Press, which specializes in radical Marxist and anarchist literature, as well as crime fiction, graphic novels, music CDs, and political documentaries. Our guest, Ramsey Kanaan. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Yes. Well, we've been very excited, like Dan said, very excited reading a lot about you. Very excited to have this interview with you. Today, when I think of the media and I think of how anarchism is projected, I think of that person wearing a dark jacket. I think of someone trying to hack something. The media shows this kind of side or the projection of the word anarchism. I think people have a something that they see, something that they've been told that this is. Can you tell us a little bit about the anarchist movement and maybe how it was that you discovered this movement and what the movement is?
Well, two things. I think firstly, it's no surprise that anarchist movements have always been reviled, mocked when they're not ignored by the media. I was going to say by the mainstream media, but that is also true of most other political media, including our contemporaries and comrades on the left. And that is because I think the mainstream authority understands that anarchism is in direct conflict with that. It stands for the negation of everything that traditional means of authority, of governance, of the way the world supposedly works. Anarchism is the opposite of that. Anarchism, I guess, historically derives from the Greek word anarchos, which literally means against authority. However, I would argue that the history of anarchism, which is a history of both ideas and how those ideas are put into practice, is not just a history of negatives. It's not just anarchism is against capitalism. Anarchism is against the state. Anarchism is against the various manifestations of injustice that we see today, of racism, of sexism, of patriarchy, etc., etc. I mean, in one sense, all of that is kind of obvious, and most of that is also what the left, from liberal to extreme left, if you like, would also agree with. I think the importance of anarchism is a particular set, and by set I mean it's not a unipolar idea, it's not a one true path, but it's a particular set of ideas and of tools and of ways to manifest those ideas into practice, which are a different tapestry, if you like, a different form of ways of how we organize, both economically, most importantly, but also socially and culturally. And that those basic tenets are several. things. Firstly, is that, like the rest of the left, anarchists largely believe that the emancipation of the working class, so-called, meaning of the vast majority of the people on this planet that actually need emancipation. I guess in more popular parlance, we call it the 99%. But nevertheless, that emancipation must come from within that body, from within the working class. And hence it's the self-emancipation of the working class. It's not a group of leaders, it's not a group of those that know better, it's not a group of party officials who know the one true path and will lead the masses into that glorious revolution. It's actually people doing it for themselves. Secondly, to kind of quote or misquote or almost quote a bunch of folks such as the Zapatistas, we build the road as we travel, meaning that anarchism is not a fixed dogma or a set of dogmas or a set of truisms or holy scripts to be interpreted, and the path to salvation is to only find the one correct interpretation of these so-called holy scriptures. But anarchism is a set of practices. And those practices, understandably, change over time. They change when one is faced with new ideas, when one is faced with different situations. Obviously, the situation that faced the toiling masses in the 19th century is very different than the situation that faces the toiling masses today. I think it's probably only in this last century, meaning in the 21st century, that we've now come to a position where more than 50% of the world's population actually live in cities or urbanized environments, for example. So the world is always changing. And I think one of the strengths of anarchism, and as I said before, one of the things which differentiates it from much of its contemporaries along the political spectrum, is its ideas, and its ideas are always formed by that interaction with reality. And of course, that interaction reality is always messy and it's always complicated, as are us simple human beings. And it's how do we continue towards that path of emancipation rather than, as I say, getting the correct holy texts down pat and having the right set of leaders who are going to interpret them for us, and then Bob's your uncle.
Yeah. Where does this start for you? Like where does you being this political start for you? Where does this originate for you? Did this come from your childhood? Was there a moment of discovery for you in your teenagehood, your young adulthood? Where does it start for you, becoming political?
I think, I mean, I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I had the great fortune to grow up in a house that was full of books, and parents, particularly my mother, who always encouraged me to read. My parents were not political. Indeed, my mother, bless her heart, in 1979, we grew up in small town Scotland. My mother in 1979, like many other women, voted for Margaret Thatcher because she thought maybe a woman could do it better than men. And that didn't get us so far. Well, actually, got us very far in the wrong direction. So I'd say my parents were not political, and that was the only time my mother voted Conservative. But I think so. Other than reading widely, reading literature, to me, I think one of the beauties of anarchism is that it's actually just common sense. One doesn't need to have a sophisticated master's degree in advanced, you name it, to understand anarchism. Anarchism is something that we practice in our daily lives every day, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not. In fact, arguably, humans only exist and continue to exist because of the practices of anarchism. One of the great founding fathers of anarchism, insofar as there are founding fathers of anarchism, was this gentleman called Peter Kropotkin, and probably his crowning work was actually written to take on actually Charles Darwin and that theory that life is a continual struggle, particularly as it involves nature. The kind of so-called survival of the fittest would be the extreme example of that philosophy. And so counter to that, he wrote something called a series of essays, which he called Mutual Aid. And that is that humans and the rest of our natural environment actually only evolve and actually grow and actually develop, not because of conflict and strife and dog eat dog and, everyone trying to be the big lion in the jungle. But the evolution actually comes because evolution and progress comes because we actually cooperate. And that's what we have to do innately to survive. And that hence human existence is an innately collective act. And we see manifestations of this, every day all around us. We do things because of that innateness, not because we're told to do it by authority, not because there are laws demanding that we do this or don't do that. Most people don't go around murdering each other just because murder is a crime. We just don't do it.
Yeah. Let me jump in with a question about, in your description of anarchism and its anti-authoritarianism, you haven't spoken specifically about the state and the difference between, like, I'm someone who comes out of the orthodox Marxist left. And so I always, there was a notion that you had to smash the state, but then build your own. But I'd like you to maybe speak to that, because I really think it's important to some of our audience. Yeah.
Notions of the state, like most of the powers of coercion, developed because of how does one centralize one's authority. Now, we saw that long before the formation of the state. We saw it with the formation of kings and queens and chieftains and clan leaders and the growth of organized religion. So it's always that power and knowledge can be centralized. The modern state, which has only existed for a few hundred years, in most cases, is an extension of that logic. Because how does one centralize authority? How does one centralize power? All the better to impose it on everyone else. So perhaps understandably, anarchists have always been opposed to the state, as the state is the institution which primarily, however it's made up, the state is based on authority, which has to be unquestionably, one has to give obedience to. One has no choice in the matter. But more importantly, the most important functions of any state is a coercive one and a punitive one. The state is there to impose its will, whatever that will may be. The state is there to protect private property. The state is there to protect so-called whatever. And so as the primary organ of which people are oppressed, I think anarchists have always been against the state. I must stress that anarchists are not against organization. Anarchists are against different forms of organization, what anarchists would call more horizontal, as opposed to top-down or pyramidical forms of organization. And anarchists have in the past, many of the arguments, again, often put by orthodox Marxists as well, this might be fine in small groups or in perhaps, I'll concede, in a little village or a neighborhood. The legendary and fantastic Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm acknowledged the anarchists in history that he, I guess, had a soft spot for, such as the Mexican Revolution or the Spanish anarchists. He called them primitive rebels, because without the iron laws of Marxism or without the state, they couldn't move beyond their kind of primitive, which, as we know, calling anyone primitive is a bit of an insult, state. So insofar as the critics of anarchism have acknowledged that maybe it kind of works in some sort of haphazard or minor way, again, I think history has proven that that's patently a load of nonsense. Again, the same Spanish anarchists that Hobsbawm dismissed as primitive rebels were organized the biggest labor movement that Spain had ever seen, and their anarchist trade union, had 3 million members and organized, the vast majority of the of the Spanish working class. Perhaps even more impressively, they organized the vast majority of the Spanish peasantry, who vastly outnumbered the working class. And during the so-called Spanish Civil War, which the anarchists called the Spanish Revolution, they actually implemented that revolution. And they collectivized agriculture. They collectivized the industry in Barcelona. And this was all in the face of a massive war going on, the so-called Civil War, fighting against the fascists. And despite fighting a war, and despite being a bunch of primitives, they actually increased production. So again, using those cliched capitalist or even Marxist metrics, they actually improved. One of the great famous cliches, it was the anarchists that actually made the trains run on time in Barcelona in 1936, which had never happened before or since. So again, one of the negatives is that anarchism just can't work. Well, certainly not on a large scale. And again, that's simply not the case.
Right. I didn't mean to get us off track, though. I know we're interested in how you came to your politics personally. So let's go back to your small town in Scotland.
Go back to my small town. To me, as a voracious reader, I read a lot of the classics as a kid. You know, your George Orwell and your Solzhenitsyn and your Camus and your Sartre. And I was a voracious reader. I also read a lot of the kind of 60s, 70s feminist literature at the time, both fiction and non-fiction. You know, I read Marilyn French, The Women's Room, and I read Marge Piercy and Ursula Le Guin, etc., etc. And to me, much of it, including reading some of the anarchist classics, to me it was just kind of common sense. Of course, we don't need authority telling us what to do. Of course, the people involved, whether it's in their local community, whether it's in their workplace, are actually those that are better able to understand how to govern themselves without having that arbitrary authority dropping it on their heads, so to speak. To me, most of this was actually just common sense. And I think that I'd still stand by that later today. You know, 40 years later, 50 years later, as I've become certainly considerably more politically sophisticated and nuanced and understand more, I think those tenets are basically the same. Anarchism is common sense, and anarchism is a fundamental belief that the vast majority of people are those best suited to organizing their own lives, economically, socially, and culturally. And in fact, as I said, already do so.
Right. And when you were a young teenager, you were drawn to punk rock, and there was at least some interplay between the politics and the music for you. Could you talk about that?
Very much so. So I in 1979, and in 1979 I was 13 years old. So your listeners who are good with math can figure out how elderly I am now. So in 1979, age 13, I discovered, or I started calling myself an anarchist, and I had a fairly sophisticated understanding of what anarchism was. I knew I was an anarchist as opposed to a Marxist, or as opposed to believing in party pop, so-called social democracy or whatever. At the same time, I discovered and plunged headfirst into the joys of punk rock. Then, as now, punk rock, like politics, is a many-layered beast, but part of the subculture, as it's called. So part of the peel back the layers beyond the mainstream, one discovers that there's always been a so-called do-it-yourself aspect of punk rock, which in itself was a bit of a misnomer. But the do-it-yourself was that since the mainstream record labels and the mainstream society wasn't going to help us, that we were going to create our own, I guess, what is now called a scene or a subculture. We were going to play in our own bands, we were going to promote our own concerts, and we were going to produce our own media to talk about this subculture. In those days, they were called fanzines. So we didn't really invent any of this stuff, but we plunged headfirst into it. And one of the similarities between so-called DIY culture and anarchism is that they're both supremely collective actions. Now, although it's called DIY, which stands for do it yourself, it's a complete misnomer. It's actually called doing it in concert with others, which would be a horrible acronym, which, whatever that is, DIT, us, something or whatever, wouldn't stick. But nevertheless, both of them are supremely collective acts. They're both acts which typically are done by folks getting together and figuring it out themselves and muddling through and learning from their mistakes. And as I said before, building the road as we travel. And it meant that that punk rock built this massive subculture, which was able to promote to. So again, I played in a punk rock band as part of that subculture. We were able to tour the world. Now, again, this is you're talking in the 1980s at this point. This is long before fax machines became de rigueur, let alone the internet. This subculture was through the old way of, writing letters to each other or talking on the phone, which is very little because phone calls are very expensive in those days. You paid by the minute. So we were able, through this underground network, much as politics was able to be done across the world, we were able to do this through traveling and writing. So we were building this kind of underground network. So I say the minor band that I was in, we toured the world. We toured Western Europe. We toured North America as part of this kind of underground structure. Again, in some small way, proving that one can do things outside of the mainstream, outside of the normal ways that apparently things have to be done and can only be done. Mm-hmm. I think I would have to say that making any more connections between a particular subculture and the forms it took or might take and a set of political ideas are tendentious at best. I'm not arguing that punk rock equals anarchism or vice versa. Not in the slightest. I think that punk rock, like several other musical genres, again, arguably like aspects of folk music and certainly aspects of reggae music, have always, or aspects today, I guess, more popularly aspects of hip hop, tend to bring out some of those more radical elements, shall we say. But I would not argue that punk in itself, any more than hip hop or reggae or folk music, are radical, let alone political forms of expression.
Mm-hmm. And then, how did you make the move from music to publishing? I mean, I know you say you were a voracious reader as a youth, but what were the steps?
Well, I think before we do that, we're gonna take a short commercial break because I think that's a very big part of the podcast right there. When we come back from this short commercial break, we're going to learn more about some independent publishing. We're going to go straight into the PM Press and how that was founded and some of the challenges of being an independent publisher. Continue on this journey with us on All Power to the Developing, and we'll be right back after this commercial break.
Hi, I'm Melissa Meyer, Associate Director of the Eastside Institute. Welcome to All Power to the Developing. I hope you're enjoying today's conversation. In each episode, we introduce you to some amazing performance activists, play revolutionaries, and developmentalists from around the world who talk to us about their creative grassroots efforts to build a better world. If you like what you hear, please follow and share the series. You can find us on Amazon, Spotify, and Podbean. We'd love to hear your comments and ideas. Like everything at the Institute, the growth of All Power to the Developing depends upon the people who create it and benefit from it. We hope you're one of them. Thanks for your support, and now back to our conversation.
Welcome back to All Power to the Developing. We are here with Ramsey Kanaan, independent publisher. And speaking of independent publishing, you founded in 2007 the PM Press. Now, people in the world may be familiar with publishing, and that's a very challenging world in itself, the world of bringing out book and bringing out literature. But can you talk to us a little bit about your journey into kind of transitioning from where you were before, just generally in the anarchist movement, in your punk rock band, and then now what led you into becoming an independent publisher?
Well, I think my love for literature, which I inculcated by my apolitical parents. So immediately for me, my passion, I guess, would be my interest was in the dissemination of ideas. And I think part of my interest in punk rock and in that kind of underground DIY culture aspect of punk was that same. I was in a band partly because I love to make music, I guess, but partly as punk rock was a way of shouting one's opinions, or and so for me, again, it's difficult to disentangle both in my youth the politics and the subcultural punk rock aspect, because to me they're kind of two sides of the same coin, I guess. So very early on, I was not only playing in a band, but hence we were being interviewed by fanzines, by punk rock fanzines. And I would say, well, why don't you send me 10 copies of the fanzine that we're in, and I'll help you distribute it, or sell it, or concerts or whatever. So at a very early age, I was starting to kind of disseminate in those days punk rock fanzines. So I was this annoying little kid kind of wandering around, kind of harassing innocent concert goers, walking up to them saying, "Hey, mister, do you want to buy a fanzine? It's only 5p. It's got all your favorite bands. It's got UK Subs and Crass and in it or whatever." And often the response would be, "What's a fanzine?" Unsurprisingly. Anyway, regardless, I think I was 15, and I was actually on my way to visit my family in Egypt. I was in London at the time, and as a keen participant in the punk rock underground, all of the greatest kind of underground punk rock bands at the time were playing in this kind of squatted club. It was an abandoned club venue in London, which they squatted for the day, like Crass and Poison Girls and Dirt and Conflict. And it was for anyone that knows what I'm talking about, everyone who was anyone was there. My band was not playing, of course, because we were, still practicing in our bedroom at the time. But anyway, I was there with my polythene bag full of fanzines harassing innocent concertgoers. At the back of the hall, I espied a bunch of old dudes wearing beards. Now, of course, it transpires later they were only 15 years older than me, but, when you're 15 years old, anyone that's older than you is automatically an, quote, old dude. And it was the case that some of them did have beards. So far from being put off by the sight of old geezers with beards, I thought, this is fantastic. I'm the one that's kind of wandering around harassing people. These guys have the good sense, A, to be sitting behind a table, but secondly, had this massive spread of literature, not just, half a dozen fanzines in a plastic bag. They've got this massive, table full of literature. So being the annoying little sponge that I am, I went up to them and said, "Hey, what are you? Who are you doing? What is this?" And it transpires that they worked in a bookstore, also in London, called Houseman's Bookstore, which actually is still there today. So in 5 Caledonian Road, which is actually on the corner from King's Cross Station. And because of one of the joys of history, because the Peace News, or this big pacifist organization, the British affiliate of the War Resisters International, if that means anything to any of your listeners, they own the building. And so hence the bookstore is still there, and they're still there despite the fact that central London, like most of the rest of the world, has been horribly developed and most people forced out. Anyway, point being is House and Bookstore is still here today, but even more importantly then, it was this fantastic hub for the dissemination of ideas. And not only was it a bookstore on 2 floors, so it had 2 floors of fantastic radical literature, and again, across the spectrum. But equally importantly for young Ramsey is they were also involved in distribution in some other people's publications, and they also did their own publishing. So to me, this was kind of like all aspects of the dissemination of ideas under one roof. And from thence on, every school holiday, every summer, Easter, whatever, Christmas, I would bugger off to London, take Greyhound buses, whatever, and stay in squats and whatever things you did when you were young, and hung out at Houseman's Bookshop. And so they were very much my mentors, and through osmosis and through their generosity, I learned kind of some of the basics of how to, I guess, buy and sell in a more formal manner. And it just my involvement with publishing and distribution kind of just grew from there. For many years, it was just me. And I started this company again as a teenager out of my bedroom in my mum's house, called AK Press, named after my mother's initials, my mother being Anne Kanaan. Though, of course, many people presume my mother's name is actually Kalashnikov, but AK is actually named after my mother. At a certain point, I think probably 1991, AK was so big that, I couldn't cope with it anymore, so to speak. It was taking up several bedrooms, not just my own. And I set it up as a workers' co-op. And I think there's 4 or 5 of us, and kind of it just all went from there. So as you mentioned, Des, in 2007, myself and a couple of other folks from AK started yet another publishing company called PM Press. I guess arguably only because obviously I'm a person of very limited vision. I only know how to do one thing in life, and I've been doing it, for the last 40 plus years.
And how did you and PM Press get to the United States?
So I actually came to the United States in my AK days. So we were doing, in the early 90s, I personally came to the United States in 1989, say touring with the aforementioned punk rock band. But being a political person as well as a punk rocker, I already had a lot of political contacts. AK was already going. And so, I made a lot more political and literary contacts with folks I'd already been corresponding with. And so by the early 80s, we were doing a massive trade, relatively speaking, so to speak, both in exporting, I guess you'd say, UK literature to America and getting it distributed in America, and vice versa. We were importing a lot of US materials. So in the early 90s, we were the US, rather the UK distributor for a bunch of political US independent presses, such as Southern Press or Common Courage or Charles H. Kerr. And similarly, we were getting a lot of the radical UK stuff into the US, both political and literary. So we were doing so much work in the United States that I managed to persuade my comrades at AK Press that we really needed to set up a US office, sphere of operations, and that it really needed to be in San Francisco, and that, I would take the short straw and I'd, go and do it, which I did. I entered the country very illegally, which you wanted to do in those days, pre 9/11, and I've been here legally, I must add, ever since.
And you're operating as an independent publisher. I think I said earlier that I could imagine just operating a general publishing house comes with its challenges, but you're operating a independent publishing house specializing in Marxist and anarchist literature. Like, what are some of the challenges that come with that? And are there any particular set of unique challenges that come with that based upon what you are specializing in?
Well, I think there are 2 fundamental challenges. The first one is that publishing in general, whatever the aspects of wherever it lies on the political spectrum, or whether it claims to be not political at all, which of course we would all argue that if you claim to be non-political, you're actually taking a political stance. But irrespective of that, publishing in general faces all kinds of challenges because in of itself it's actually not profitable. No one makes any money selling books, whether they're left-wing books or right-wing books. And in fact, that those that do make money typically are doing it because they have some form of subsidy. And they're part of a much larger multinational conglomeration who think that it's worth whatever reason having a book division they're subsidized by a political party or a trade union or whatever, a non-profit. Most poetry is published by art grants funding. Nothing I'm saying here is particularly controversial. So the main challenge for any publisher is financial. In our case, since we've had no support from anyone, politically or non-profit world or anything else, the main challenge is how do we act to destroy capitalism while being exemplary capitalists? Because our only source of income is by selling stuff. So we're in that bind, or that contradiction, or that tension, if you like, that most radicals find themselves have to exist within capitalism while trying to destroy it. We have to pay rent. We have to have a landlord, even though we hate landlords and we're politically opposed to landlords, etc., etc., etc. So, but I think that's a position faced by anyone involved in publishing or the dissemination of ideas. It's economically, it's really difficult for those kind of basic banal reasons. There are a whole bunch of other basic banal reasons which have added to the problem. Since the dawn of neoliberalism, adult literacy has fallen dramatically. People are also reading less for all kinds of reasons, of which the rise of the internet is only the last or the latest. So again, there are a whole bunch of other reasons why people are reading less than they were 20 years ago or 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But again, these are the same waters that anyone would be swimming in, so to speak, whatever they're publishing, not just people that publish really good stuff like we do. The other flip side to the coin, or to that dynamic, if you like, is I've always argued that there's the dissemination of ideas, and actually the impact of ideas and the relevance of ideas always rises and falls with social movements, and that publishing, and again, all publishing, not just radical publishing, is what feeds into those social movements or the antagonists of those social movements. And of course, I'm saying social movements is a neutral term. Us on the left, we tend to think social movements as an automatically as a lefty thing, and that's patently not the case. There are all kinds of right-wing social movements. The Tea Party was a social movement, undoubtedly, which took over the Republicans. But they're a social movement, and like the Tea Party and like the right, there are all kinds of ideas which feed into and help propagate and come out of such social movements. But from our point of view, obviously, when I'm talking about social movements, I'm talking about left-wing social movements. So again, ideas and the dissemination of ideas rise and fall with those social movements. I'll just give two very quick examples. The biggest of those social movements is undoubtedly has been the 60s. Typically actually means, when people talk about the 60s, they actually mean the 70s. They kind of mean like 65 to 75, actually. That era not only saw the rise or the invention, so to speak, of feminism, of black liberation, of gay liberation, of Chicano liberation, of native liberation, etc., 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 but hence saw a concomitant rise in the literature involved in that. It wasn't just the rise of secondary feminism, but it was literally the invention of women's fiction. Stonewall wasn't just herald the dawn, so to speak, or the rise of gay liberation, but hence also of the concept of gay literature, whether fiction or non-fiction didn't exist before then. Being a homosexual was outlawed, it was illegal. So the concept of its literature literally didn't exist. So I say this, in these stark, obvious terms, this literature comes out of and is a part of and plays into and draws upon such social movements. The next obvious example I'll give will be the George Floyd uprising, which is undoubtedly, in terms of kind of boots on the ground, is the biggest social movement. Again, I'd hesitate to call it a social movement because it's actually so short-lived. But let's just call it a social movement for the sake of my argument. And certainly, in terms of mass demonstrations, there was more people involved in the George Floyd uprising than ever before in US history. So it's the biggest mass movement, let's call it that, if not a social movement, that the US has seen to date. Unsurprisingly, it saw a mass explosion of interest, however facile and however perhaps misplaced and however co-opted by the mainstream corporation. It wasn't just that Starbucks and Amazon and everyone had, Black Lives Matter banners on their websites and all that kind of bullshit. But interest in books on anti-racism and black struggle and against the police, literally became New York Times bestsellers. The New York Times bestsellers of those few months were literally, Ibrahim X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There was the frankly appalling gibberish and garbage that was white fragility. There was, anyway, you get my drift.
Mm-hmm.
These books not only sold literally millions of copies and outsold all of their competitors, so to speak, or their contemporaries, but they literally saved publishing. For the last 15, perhaps 20 years, the total amount of books sold in every category, meaning fiction, non-fiction, romance, technical, Christian, you name it, has been falling. When I'm saying there's a crisis in publishing, people are no longer reading. Right? The number of books being consumed or certainly being purchased, and these are official industry figures, has been falling every year spectacularly, like 2 or 3%. Which those of you who are into Marxist economics will understand that a degrowth of 2-3% a year is fucking huge, to use an official economics term. So for the last 15 or 20 years, this stuff's been declining. The George Floyd uprising reversed that.
In the face of this decline, how is it that PM Press has been able to survive and thrive?
I think partly because we actually are part of those wider social movements. And as you will know on the left, just because the social movements are not part of the mainstream doesn't mean they necessarily disappear entirely. So I think that's part of our success. I think part of our success is, for me, or certainly throughout my life as an activist, if you count publishing and distribution as my modest contribution to activism, I suppose, the biggest challenge has always not been production. It's not been producing good books. I think anyone with a certain amount of skill and a certain amount of patience and time can produce a good-looking book and can make sure it's well edited and proofread and copy edited and all that. The fact that most people don't bother producing good-looking books or don't bother with editing or copy editing is a different statement of the sorry affair of publishing. But nevertheless, anyone that was willing to take the time and patience and some care and effort and money can produce a good product. The challenge to me has always been, how do you disseminate that product? How do you get it out from under your bed, which was often the case for the first 10 years of my life. Those books I published were literally, I slept on them, boxes and boxes of books. How do you get them out from under your bed or out from under the warehouse in front of people's hands? Now, if as I've been arguing, the book trade has been dying for the last 20 years, in fact, I would argue it's been dying ever since I've been involved, the last 40 years, the challenge has always been not just how do we better use the book trade, but if that's a dying beast, how do we get books in people's hands and not through the book trade? And that's always been the challenge. And I think insofar as we've had success, that's where our successes lie. One of the obvious ways that we do that is we have a monthly book club or a subscription scheme. Again, we didn't invent these things. People have been subscribing to newspapers and Sears catalogs for hundreds of years now. But again, we have a similar subscription scheme, unimaginatively called the House of PM, where people give us money every month and in return they get sent our books. This is a way of us actually, of course, of guaranteeing sales. We have over 1,000 subscribers, so hence, we have guaranteed sales of our books that are not through the book trade. The other obvious way that we do it is that we take our books to where we can find people. And that is we table at events. We table all kinds of events. We tabled, I think, last year at over 400 events. Those events are everywhere from those that you would imagine, you think of, the big book festivals. You guys are in New York, so, we're at the Brooklyn Book Festival, or we're at the comic festival, we're at the whatever. But also we do all the political conferences, the academic conferences. But perhaps more importantly than that, or as importantly, we're also the weirdos that are tabling at the demonstrations. We're also the weirdos that are tabling at rock concerts. I guess, I say I haven't grown up in the last 40 years Or now again, we're behind the table. We're now the weird old guys with the beards behind the table at the rock concert. People going, what the hell are you guys doing here? What's this? Though, actually, we don't have beards. I suppose is the only difference.
Right.
So again, it's how do we struggle to get books? We can't force people to read, but how do we get them at least in front of their eyes and hopefully into their hands? And that's been the perennial struggle. And I think we've been somewhat successful at that. And we've deliberately structured the way that we do business to try and enhance that. So we're unusual, for example, within the book trade and within publishing, whether it's of left-wing publishing or otherwise, that not only do our own mail order, but we have our own warehouse. So we're actually able to supply whomever with books ourselves. Again, to use those classic Marxist terminology, we actually own the means of production. Or rather, we own the means of distribution. We don't actually own the means of production. We don't print the books ourselves. We have a printing press. But we own the means of distribution. So the post office doesn't come down on this, as it came down on in 1917 and basically stopped the dissemination of radical ideas with the, what was it called, when you're against the war, the acts that made it illegal to be send stuff through the mail that was against the war.
The Sedition Act, I think.
Sedition Act, thank you. So the Sedition Act of 1917 basically destroyed the left because they had no way to distribute their journals, their magazines, their pamphlets, their books through the mail, which in those days was the only way to do it.
Yeah.
Throughout this whole time you've been speaking and throughout the whole interview, it's kind of been like a journey, like from your youth through reading a lot of literature, through getting more political, through getting involved in the punk rock scene, to the AK press, to the PM press. When you look back at all of this, how does it make you feel emotionally about your journey as an anarchist in relation to where you are in the world today?
Difficult to answer that, really. I mean, in one sense, it makes me feel old, I guess. It's been, 42 or 43 years or whatever. But that facetious comment aside, difficult to say, really. The world is considerably more fucked than it was then. But we are continually shown. I think the important thing for me is that nothing comes out of a vacuum. There's always a context. I didn't come out of a vacuum. I had my mentors. I had my ideas. I had the rivers that I swam in. Those rivers, punk rock, were going back a couple of years. And the river of anarchism has been going for, whenever you want to date these things, hundreds, if not thousands of years of these radical ideas. And more importantly, the movements and folks that are actually putting into practice. To me, it's important to build structures and to build institutions, because that's how I came into contact with radical ideas. You're not born with them, and those ideas that you are born with, I talked earlier about common sense. They get refined and contradicted and produced in actual the nitty gritty of real life. So the importance to me, and I think if I'm allowed a little pat on the back, I think it's helping to build those structures. I think that the most important thing I've done is help to build those structures in some way which enable the production and the dissemination of those ideas. I'm no longer involved with AK Press. I'm actually very proud, not for selfish reasons, that AK Press is obviously not just about me. Despite me and a couple other people leaving AK Press is still doing just fine. And AK Press is still producing and disseminating ideas. Again, what I think of them is actually irrelevant. The importance is that these ideas are getting out there and that people are interacting with them. I think AK produces some good ideas. I think it produces some bad ideas. I could say the same about most publishers or most ideas. Again, who cares? The most important thing is to build those structures, to build those institutions that give people a set of frameworks, shall we say, that they can interact with, that they can live their lives, they can develop, and hopefully we can all collectively, make a difference in the world.
Platform to build off of. And what can people look for from you, from the PM Press in the upcoming future? Is there anything for people to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I encourage people to sign up on our email list. I encourage people to go to our website. In one sense, one is always asked, so as a publisher, we publish about 30, 35 books a year. So one is always asked, hey, what are you particularly excited about? And while I am definitely excited about more than others, in one sense, it's like asking a parent, who's your favorite child? So it's difficult for me to pick out both of those kind of political / familial reasons to pick out certain books. It's also a bit tricky because I'm a senile old bastard. And because publishing, if we're doing 35 books a year, it means at any point at any time, there are perhaps 100 books in various stages of production. And then, of course, as I said before, the challenge is once they're out, is to keep them being relevant, to keep getting them out there. It's not to forget about them the day after they're published. So we're actually talking about hundreds and hundreds of books that kind of me and the rest of PM are actively involved with every day, if that makes sense. So I'm not trying to, downplay spotlighting anything in particular. Again, I would encourage the listeners, are they so inclined or so inspired to check out our website. You'll see a lot of the books there. Well, you'll see all of our books and a whole lot more there, and ways to interact. The other thing I would encourage people is to read, to think critically, and to support this podcast and anything else. These structures don't exist, as I said, by themselves. They only exist because of the support and interaction of other folks. Without that, we're wandering around in the desert all alone.
Yeah. So true. Thank you.
Yes. And we would like to thank you, Ramsey Kanaan, for being on this episode of All Power to the Developing. We would like to say to our listeners out there, All Power to the Developing is available on most digital streaming platforms, if not all. We would like you to follow, comment, subscribe, like, share a comment. Let us know what you like about the episode. Write to us at podcast@eastsideinstitute.org. We would love to read your response at the end of the episode and let the rest of the world know what you love. We are in trying times, ladies and gentlemen, so we would like to continue the development. If you would like to visit the PM Press, that'd be great. We would like to encourage more literacy. Pick up a book. I'm going to try to pick up some books. And this is All Power to Development. Once again, I would like to thank my co-host, Dan Friedman. And I would like to thank our guest, Ramsey Kanaan of the PM Press. And once again, all power to the developing.
Thank you, Ramsey.
All Power to the Developing was made possible in part by Growing Social Therapeutics, the Baylor Wolf Fund.